You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
On July 20th, 1969, an estimated 600 million people around the world watched Neil Armstrong step onto the surface of the moon. It remains one of the most witnessed events in human history, verified independently by the Soviet Union's own tracking stations, confirmed by retroreflectors the astronauts left on the lunar surface that scientists still bounce lasers off today, and backed by roughly 380 kilograms of moon rock samples that have been studied by geologists in dozens of countries for over half a century. And yet, within just a few years, a significant portion of the American public had convinced themselves that none of it had happened at all. It's worth sitting with just how thoroughly corroborated the Apollo landings actually are, because the scale of it is easy to lose in the noise of the conspiracy theory itself. 6 separate crewed missions landed between 1969 and 1972, each one tracked in real time, not just by NASA's own Deep Space Network, but by independent radio telescopes and tracking stations operated by other nations, including, notably, the Soviet Union, which had every incentive in the world to catch the United States faking a Cold War propaganda victory, and never once did. The Apollo astronauts brought home roughly 380 kilograms of lunar material combined. By comparison, robotic Soviet lunar missions using uncrewed landers only ever managed to retrieve about 326 grams, less than 1,000th as much. If the entire crewed program had been theater, the prop department would have needed to manufacture from scratch hundreds of kilograms of rock with an isotopic composition and micrometeorite weathering pattern indistinguishable from genuine ancient lunar material, a feat that remains scientifically implausible even with today's technology, let alone 1969's. The man most responsible for that shift has a far less dramatic origin story than the conspiracy he created. Bill Kaysing was a former U.S. Navy officer with a degree in English, hired in 1956 as a technical writer for Rocketdyne, the company that helped build the engines used in the Apollo program. He left the company in 1963, years before the actual moon landing took place, and by his own later admission, had no real background in rocketry or aerospace engineering. In 1976, he self-published a slim, deeply strange book titled "We Never Went to the Moon: America's $30 billion Swindle," arguing that NASA had calculated only a 0.0017% chance of a successful crewed landing, and had therefore staged the entire mission in a studio, rather than risk a public failure during the space race. Kaysing's case rested heavily on a handful of visual details he insisted couldn't be explained. The American flag appearing to ripple despite the moon having no atmosphere or wind, the total absence of visible stars in the lunar surface photographs, and shadows in the images that he claimed fell at inconsistent angles, as though multiple studio lights had been used instead of a single, distant sun. He also leaned heavily on his own account of witnessing repeated engine failures during rocket tests at Rocketdyne's Santa Susana lab, arguing that if the comparatively simple Atlas engines failed as often as he'd personally seen, the far more complex Saturn V system NASA needed for a moon mission simply couldn't have worked reliably enough to risk a live crewed flight, a closely related strand of the theory, popularized separately by other writers in the years that followed. crowd claimed that the astronauts couldn't possibly have survived passing through the Van Allen radiation belts surrounding Earth, and that any crew attempting it would have been fatally irradiated before ever reaching the moon. Every one of these claims has since been addressed by physicists and photographers alike. The flag rippled because it was hung from a horizontal rod, specifically so it would appear to fly in photographs, and any apparent movement in the video came from astronauts twisting the pole into the lunar soil. The stars are missing for the same reason they vanish from a smartphone photo taken in daylight. The cameras were exposed correctly for the blindingly bright lunar surface, a setting far too fast to register the comparatively faint light of distant stars. And the inconsistent shadows are simply the product of an uneven lunar surface interacting with a single light source, the same optical effect that makes shadows on Earth appear to fan out at different angles across a bumpy field. The Van Allen belt argument fares no better under scrutiny. Radiation physicists have pointed out for decades that the Apollo trajectories were deliberately plotted to minimize time spent in the most intense regions of the belts, and that the spacecraft passed through the danger zones quickly enough that the total radiation dose the astronauts absorbed was well within survivable limits, comparable, by some estimates, to a handful of medical X-rays rather than a lethal exposure. As for Kaysing's claims about unreliable rocket engines, aerospace engineers have noted that early testing failures are a completely normal and expected part of any rocket development program, and that the specific problems Kaysing witnessed at Rocketdyne in the 1950s had been identified and engineered around years before the Saturn V ever carried a crew, the same iterative process that precedes essentially every successful rocket program before or since. None of that stopped the theory from spreading. Kaysing's book landed in America at a uniquely vulnerable moment, a country reeling from the leaked Pentagon Papers, the unfolding Watergate scandal, and a wave of congressional investigations into CIA misconduct that had already taught an entire generation to distrust official government narratives by default. A 1976 Gallup poll found that nearly 28% of Americans surveyed believed the moon landing had been faked, a staggering number for an event witnessed by hundreds of millions in real time barely 7 years earlier. The theory found new life again in 1978 with the release of the Hollywood thriller Capricorn 1, a fictional film about a faked Mars landing that borrowed so heavily from Kaysing's ideas that some viewers came away convinced its plot was really describing what had happened to Apollo 11. The Kubrick myth deserves its own moment here because of how specifically absurd its origin turns out to be. The claim holds that legendary director Stanley Kubrick was secretly enlisted by NASA to film the fake moon landing footage, largely because his 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey had demonstrated an unusually convincing, technically accurate vision of space travel for its era. What conspiracy theorists rarely mention is why 2001 looked so accurate in the first place. Kubrick had consulted with dozens of actual aerospace corporations, universities, and observatories during production, specifically to get the physics and visuals right. The same publicly documented research process that convinced people backward that he must have had inside access to a real space program. Some later variations of the myth even claimed Kubrick left cryptic confessions buried in his later films, a theory that has never produced anything resembling actual evidence, but that has proven remarkably durable in online conspiracy communities regardless. By 2001, the theory had grown mainstream enough that the Fox television network aired a primetime special titled Conspiracy Theory. Did We Land on the Moon? Presenting Kaysing's arguments and their variants to a national audience with the polished production values of a real investigative documentary. NASA felt compelled to respond publicly, publishing a rebuttal piece through its own science communications team, addressing the special's claims point by point. A strange spectacle in itself, a federal space agency having to formally explain on the record that one of the 20th century's most thoroughly documented achievements had, in fact, occurred. By the 1990s and 2000s, the theory had calcified into a permanent fixture of American pop culture, and the loudest surviving voice pushing it was a filmmaker and self-described investigator named Bart Sibrel. Sibrel had spent years producing documentaries arguing that Apollo footage showed telltale signs of studio fakery, and in September of 2002, he got the confrontation he'd apparently been building toward for years. Sibrel approached Buzz Aldrin, one of only 2 men who had actually walked on the moon that day, and by then, in his early 70s, outside a Beverly Hills hotel, thrust a Bible in his face and demanded Aldrin swear on it that he had truly walked on the moon, repeatedly calling him a liar and a coward on camera. Aldrin, a former Air Force fighter pilot and combat veteran who had spent over 3 decades being needled by people who insisted his life's defining achievement never happened, did not swear on the Bible. He punched Sibrel in the face. The footage went viral before viral was even the word people used for it, replayed endlessly on television news and, later, across the early internet. Local prosecutors declined to press charges against the 72-year-old astronaut, citing evidence that Sibrel had provoked and harassed him. Sibrel, for his part, has never recanted. Speaking to a Florida newspaper years later, he confirmed he still believes the landing was staged, a position he has held publicly for decades despite the punch, the physics, and the near-total consensus of the scientific community against him. What makes the moon landing hoax theory such a strange case study compared to most conspiracy theories is how cleanly its central claims can be tested and how consistently they've failed every test thrown at them. The retroreflector panels the Apollo astronauts left behind are still in active use today. Observatories unearth fire lasers at them and measure the reflected beam to track the moon's slowly changing orbit with millimeter precision, a feat that would be impossible if nothing had ever been physically placed on the lunar surface. Independent lunar orbiters launched decades later by India, Japan, and NASA itself have all photographed the actual Apollo landing sites from orbit, showing the descent stages, equipment, and even the astronauts' footpath trails still visible in the airless lunar dust. And the Soviet Union, the one nation on Earth with every geopolitical incentive to expose an American hoax and the technical capability to track the Apollo spacecraft independently via its own deep space network, never once, at any point during or after the Cold War, disputed that the landings happened. And yet the theory hasn't gone anywhere. Polling from the 2000s and 2000s has consistently found that somewhere between 5 and 20% of Americans still express doubt that humans actually walked on the moon, with belief notably higher among younger respondents who weren't alive to watch it happen live. In Russia, belief in the hoax theory has polled dramatically higher still, and when NASA's Artemis II mission carried a new generation of astronauts around the moon in 2026, a fresh wave of conspiracy content resurfaced almost immediately online, insisting that this mission, too, had been faked. Proof that once a hoax narrative takes hold, it doesn't need new evidence to keep growing. It just needs a new headline to attach itself to. too. Researchers who study conspiracy belief professionally tend to describe the moon landing theory as a fairly unusual case, precisely because of how testable and how thoroughly tested it already is. Rick Feinberg, an astronomer who has publicly debated Kaysing himself on television, has observed that believers tend to recycle the same handful of arguments indefinitely, regardless of how many times each one gets addressed, suggesting the belief isn't really being driven by the specific photographic details at all, but by something underneath them. Feinberg and other researchers in the field have described the modern hoax theory as functioning less like a scientific dispute and more like an ideological or political stance, a way of signaling distrust in institutions generally, with the moon landing serving as a convenient, emotionally resonant stand-in for that broader suspicion. That would help explain why fact-based rebuttals, laser retroreflector measurements, foreign orbiter photographs, independent Soviet tracking data rarely seem to change anyone's mind. The dispute was arguably never really about photography or physics to begin with. Bill Kaysing died in 2005, having spent nearly 3 decades as the reluctant godfather of a theory he could never actually prove, and the scientific community could never fully kill. Buzz Aldrin, meanwhile, is, as of this recording, the last living member of the Apollo 11 crew, having outlived both Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins, and has spent the decades since his moonwalk doing something almost unheard of in the conspiracy theory era, publicly, consistently, and without wavering, telling exactly the same story he told in 1969. So the real mystery here was never really about missing stars or rippling flags. It's a question about human psychology instead. Why does a theory built on claims that have been thoroughly and repeatedly debunked by physicists, photographers, and independent foreign governments alike keep finding new believers, generation after generation, moon mission after moon mission? And if you were the one man left alive who actually made the walk, how many more times do you think you'd have to tell the truth before people stopped asking you to prove it with your fists?